Hello again, and welcome back. I've decided to kind of almost add a little bit to some of the videos that I created in the past, mostly the one about uniqueness and courage and understanding dogma, and also how to kind of shift your mindset. So I'm going to kind of build on those three and almost add um, a little bit to each to kind of create some kind of new narrative that's building on each other. So just bear with me if some of it seems repetitive, and we'll go from there. So I wanted to kind of remain true to the idea of talking about family and not allowing myself to get too specific about any one style of parenting or one form of family style that seems like I'm picking on it a little bit too much, because it's really difficult to say there's any one family structure that works, especially in a postmodern age where, a one person individual can assume, because I have siblings somewhere and we kind of get together, that's basically our family. And that's who's to take away from that, really, right? So I'm going to maybe just start off by saying that um, having an understanding of the way we can bridge meaning without feeling threatened is something that we can work on from um, this new idea of meaning making and rebirth, with revisiting tradition, holding some ideas instead of throwing them out, saying, well, I'm just going to think about it differently. So if I maybe didn't want to agree with something, I'm going to accept it, but then I'm going to revisit it by building on it. And then maybe that'll help me understand why maybe in the first place I didn't want to accept it at all. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a chapter verse. I'm not going to actually recite the verse. I'm just going to leave it at the bottom for anybody who's interested to actually read it at their own leisure and kind of with their own idea of what it might mean for them. Just to kind of elucidate what revisiting something in the past that we didn't want to acknowledge can do for us if we try to just change our heart a little bit about it, and how it might open up our mind in some way. So giving ourselves the ability to think of scripture, for example, as something that is inspired. So now I'm thinking, well, the prophet was just a man named Muhammad, and he used to get inspiration that used to shock people a little bit. Like, this is outside the ordinary for our time. Like, how do you think like that? And so that's kind of how he kind of gained a gathering of people who are kind of like, we want to learn a little bit more about who you are. And then eventually they notice what he's practicing and they're like, well, we want to try that too. And basically that's what we know today to be popular culture. Like, some things just take hold of people and then they all want to be a part of it. And in doing so, it kind of becomes some kind of movement in some way. And it's typically around fashion. Sometimes it is about ideas. So if people think about green energy, for example, and how to keep the environment clean, then they want to maybe pay a little bit extra to buy a more expensive car, but they know that in the big scheme of things, it's actually going to be its own payoff, right? So when you try to understand this in the context of integrating time and destiny, you might be a little bit more appreciative of how we don't have to look at things linearly, but almost as though it's not necessarily like a glob of like mismatched chaos, but it's almost to say, how do people's actions actually influence fate in a collective way without us really understanding that it doesn't necessarily take away from them or give them in any way? So hold that thought in your mind and just keep it there and see how you might want to evolve with this idea. So if you think about your own heritage and your own culture, I tend to kind of view my own heritage in a negative light, mostly because I am a very strict monotheist, and anybody who puts up an idea about um, one idea being an overarching correct idea, I really struggle with. And I say, okay, it could be for a specific time, but I'm still allowed to think about it on my own and make more meaning of it for myself, and then decide how to use that idea. What we understand of the Pharaoh is he was almost a totalitarian ruler, as though to say, I am God and I am the one that has all of this around me. It belongs to me. And therefore, all of you people who live in this land are my subjects, and you must do as I say. So, to have that kind of understanding or that rhetoric in present day almost sounds like that's really unusual. And so it might kind of strike you as very, very like contrasting to anything you are kind of familiar with. So if you think in those terms, you might want to say, yeah, I don't really want to study ancient civilization, especially if it's something that has to do with that way of thinking, because what if I start thinking that way? That's valid, because I do kind of argue that sometimes if you study and you're immersed in something for so long, unbeknownst to you, you kind of start to think that way anyway. So you have to kind of be careful. So I started to think about this myself, as though to say, I'm in a rut because I take down a lot of my tradition, but what am I replacing it with? Like, how am I allowing myself to advance and build on these ideas? So what we understand of Moses, who lived in Egypt, some argue, how did he evolve with what his society was kind of struggling with, and that they were almost enslaved, and that they weren't really given the freedom of expression, and he had to almost really, really fight with that. And even if it kept him impoverished, he was fine with that. He would kind of lament with God, like say, you've chosen me and you've given me all this, and even though you're helping me, I still feel impoverished and I feel really almost neglected by you. But in spite of that, he didn't give up. He almost just let his people kind of fall behind, and he was just like, I'm just going to go on my own. And then he was almost happy to die. So now think of that and think of the cycle of rebirth. In this verse, it talks about how we start off as infants, seemingly with a blank slate, as though we don't know anything. And now hold that thought and think about it as though we inherit consciousness as we move ahead in time. And then the verse talks about how as we grow, we develop with time and we gain more knowledge. And then as we get into old age, we may forget what we have learned, and then we die. So some people who don't really know what to believe in yet, they might just believe that that's the end. Who's to say that people who have died came back? And how do they know that they came back? And what do we know about anything other than just a linear kind of progression of time? So they might argue, like, what's the use? I don't have to do anything in life. I can just sit back and chill, and if I don't make the most of my life, that's fine. I die, and then that's the end. But think about it from a different perspective. Think about it, what if I do contribute to life because I believe that there's a cycle of rebirth, and I'm going to come back, and somehow I'm going to find something waiting for me that's going to help me continue forward, based on what I kind of already contributed to from my past. So if you think of it from that regard, you almost want to understand, what is it that would want to hold you back? Like, why would you want to change? This is called nihilism, where sometimes people understand that nothing literally means there's no existence, like there's no meaning. Where some people understand nothing to mean there's no suffering, meaning you are not attached to any particular way of thinking, or loving something, that without it you become almost desolate, or it shakes your foundation in some kind of way. So understanding these nuances in meaning will really help you kind of understand what groundwork you want to kind of build to help you build on top of that and almost build your identity in a firm way. So if you think, for example, if you go to the ancient ruins in Egypt, in the north, which is oddly enough at the bottom of the country instead of near the Mediterranean, you will find the depictions of certain gods that they used to kind of build and erect to kind of venerate different ways of seeing. I don't know, I haven't studied the actual ancient civilization of Egypt, so I can't really speak to it, but it's something that's common in a lot of traditions, where they have these monuments, or they've erected some kind of symbol to suggest this is what our past was, and we take pride in this. In some cultures, the idea of having these is almost a threat to what they understand monotheism to be. Because some people assume, well, if you have it up, that means people are going to worship it, and they're not going to see that God is the one that created it from before this structure. This used to be an ancient belief. Maybe to some degree it's still present to this day, who's to say? But what if we, instead of just wanting to tear it down, we think, okay, maybe in the past that people did worship this, but what if right now we have evolved to remembering that this is actually meant to just help us enjoy something that used to happen in the past, and the way people used to think, and how the progress of knowledge is something we enjoy witnessing. And from that, you're not really repeating that cycle of trauma where if people don't like something, they just tear it down. So in the past, during the Enlightenment in Europe, there was this movement of iconoclasm where people were um, trying to re-understand what the Bible was and what monotheism is. And so they tore down, or they took down, a lot of the art or the depictions of art in churches, or um, anything that was kind of related to religion and was depicted in an artful way sometimes got destroyed. So this is something that I struggle with now. And back then, when I was learning this at Carleton, I didn't really know how to make sense of it, because I'm a person who, just anybody, actually, anybody who goes into nature, just naturally you feel better, and you're almost at awe with like the color and the vibrancy. And it's its own art, right? And not everybody is able to put words to these feelings. So if you think in Europe, if there was this energy of knowledge and wanting to understand, and the only way people could understand how to depict this was with art, whether it's clay or whether it's actual canvas and oil paintings, it's still a way of wanting to desperately make meaning of something, and you don't have the words yet, but you need to express it. And feeling that you're restless or you're unhappy. And so this was their way of creating meaning for themselves. And it's usually later on in life, after they've passed, that this art is somehow preserved, and then curators come and they kind of put it in a certain way where people can kind of become connoisseurs, like almost wonder about I wonder what happened at this time, and it almost gives them a sort of lens into what the culture was like at the time. And it becomes a way of creating culture in a contemporary context, because you can have dinner parties around it, you can have social events at museums, or like family dinner parties, even when people purchase this art and then display it in their home. So imagine all this remaining rich in a culture, like, and what that kind of creates. I went to the library yesterday, and in downtown we have a lot of architecture that's still from the 1800s, and with it they've created really, really modern architecture alongside it, or parts of it, alongside parts of it. So it creates this really nice contrast. It's almost like you feel like this kind of, not quite old world, but it is a little bit older than what we are in present day. And that contrast almost kind of creates this deep-seated sort of feeling of, I have a new identification with time now. Like, I'm not completely out of space and time. So when you think of this, you can understand how if we evolve worship to something that's not itself a symbol that is a god, but it's a symbol to remind us to worship. So remember, we talked about how worship is something that's very personal. So just remembering something in a certain way, or being grateful, or deciding to desist from something, so delaying gratification around something, is its own form of worship, because you're doing it for a higher purpose, for the betterment of yourself, or the universe in some way. So if these little tweaks of meaning in your heart are present, and you're thinking about it all the time, they actually make mountains of difference in your actual metaphysical well-being. And in so doing, it just reverberates, because you don't have that angst around nothing makes sense, I can't integrate anything. Maybe there's a very few people that I can relate to because we don't share much in common. In knowing how to kind of find these little nuances that bridge and start to create meaning, we start to appreciate the commonalities across cultures, instead of just noticing like stark differences. So if you relate this back to governments around the world and how we want to try to understand pluralism, you can imagine the strides that this will allow, with how we can aim to continue to practice what things remain common amongst populations. Because again, in the past, if art wasn't something that was appreciated by a lot of the population, it might have been something that was almost dismissed, which is unfortunate, because now that we appreciate art, we understand how to evolve with it, and how it can create new ideas and meanings as we evolve. Kind of like what this verse has kind of allowed me to think about. So because in the past, I used to think in that kind of linear way with life, like it's life and death, and then we don't come back to earth. But now that I keep revisiting the idea of what is rebirth and what is reincarnation, I'm starting to think maybe our idea of heaven or felicity is in coming back with renewed consciousness about our existence, and that's its own pleasure. And we just relish that nuance and that connection that comes with people who understand how we think and want to think with us and converse with us. So knowing this, you can kind of understand why not wanting to necessarily push your idea on anybody is something that you come to value and other people come to value as well. Because if we're not necessarily on the same level of understanding, anybody who speaks in a completely different context or something that we can't relate to yet, it kind of feels like you're kind of impinging on something that I don't understand yet and I don't know how to, and not being able to relate to it almost creates this chasm, and I don't know how to bridge it yet. So sometimes knowing how to start a conversation is something I'm learning, because being someone who's very introverted and closed in, I still have to learn that skill. So knowing this and knowing the kind of work that you like to do or the personality that you are will kind of invite you to think about, well, what would I want to do as like a lifetime job? Especially if it's something that's beginning to look like an online business. If I am to go into the world, what community would I want to be a part of? And how would I use travel to my advantage? So going back to this verse and about travel and the importance of enjoying life and culture and the diversity that it offers, you can pause here and think about reading the verse, or you can continue on and just listen. But, excuse me, every time I read this verse, like or have in the past, it speaks to me in a very broad way. Like I don't really think about it in any kind of particular nuance-filled way. So when I read it this time, because I've already thought about life and death in a different kind of context, I'm starting to wonder about people who die seemingly early in life. So imagine I'm a parent and I have a 20-year-old kid. And one night he was coming back from school, or she was coming back from school, maybe 11 o'clock at night, and it was raining or it was snowing, and they got in a car accident and they died. So for me, I might be in despair and almost like, man, I had a good family. I brought things forward in such a good way. I did my best. And this kid has so much potential, so much to live for. Like, why were they removed from their work? And you're allowed to go through this cycle of grief. And after, you might think, wait, I've given this a little bit of thought about how the universe works. How can I frame this in a positive light? So imagine, for example, like what we know about artists is that there's a new idea that this person is working on, this 20-year-old. He's very progressive, or she's very progressive, and maybe the ideas that they have will not be supported yet in the world. So imagine how discouraging that could be. You have this idea and you've got that sort of joy that's like, oh, I've made this discovery and I want to share it. But you don't know yet that it's not going to be accepted in the world yet, because maybe people aren't ready to think that way yet, or for whatever reason. So imagine what that high is for that person, and then what a plummet that would be to maybe be attacked or to be like, thrown out of society for some reason. So it would actually be a mercy that they ended up dying, because the world's not ready for that idea yet. So if you think about reincarnation and rebirth, and how if we work kindly for our future, when we are reborn again, that idea is going to be waiting for us in some way. We talked about how this is kind of being charitable to yourself in the future. So imagine that idea waits for you and it doesn't go to anybody else. That could actually be kind of similar to what we understand to be heaven or felicity, because it's almost like the universe already knows that you really love this and you can't wait to share it. But because the world isn't ready yet, we can't change the world to suit just you. We just have to wait for time. So it's like, okay, we're going to wait for you to kind of grow back into this idea when the world has kind of caught up, and then you get to continue with it. So it's almost like you're building. So this is why legacy and family and all this is something that people come to value. And it's venerated within tradition, obviously, because you'll understand how in the scripture, sometimes you have prophets who have family trees, and they talk about how it helps. The prophet was from a family that was distinct in his tribe, but from reading his story, they didn't really accept him very much. So it was almost like there are exceptions to every rule. Like he was an orphan and he had a very difficult time being accepted by his tribe. So it's almost to say that he was given all these hardships so that he can be relatable from any kind of perspective of life, if you're very, very affluent or if you're very impoverished. So this is kind of like a good question to ask yourself about how consciousness works, how destiny works, the way we can understand time as a construct. And then outside of that, you can think about God as your own way of being inspired by your consciousness. That way, when you think about God, it's not like a authoritative or authoritarian being that's almost just kind of like dictating ideas. It's more of a, sometimes you hear me thinking about how I talk about God, it can be like a playful and kind of lovable interaction, because in doing that, you allow yourself to relax and you're not so serious about religion and life the way sometimes we've maybe been taught to think about it. We still have that reverence where certain ideas and certain topics or certain stories kind of bring a little bit of quiet to our heart, and we just want to kind of meditate on the meaning quietly. And that's okay. We can have a little bit of both. So now that you understand this kind of narrative or this kind of lens into life, you can understand why God actually explains himself as the merciful, the compassionate. It's usually the verse or the description that's most oftenly repeated in history regarding God. Like, God is love, God is mercy, and most recently it's usually that God will say, my mercy comes before my wrath. So it's almost like I keep giving you chances to try again and try again and try again, until maybe you might actually be hurting somebody else with all your tries, that I have to almost make it clear that you can't go past this way now and you have to try a different way, because otherwise you might hurt somebody or hurt yourself. So now that we understand what heaven is and what Felicity is and what hell is, we can try to think of it in more abstract terms rather than a concrete place. And in doing so, we're not so worried, or we don't have ultimatums, or we don't threaten people. Like, especially some traditions with kids, they'll say, you can't do this because if you do this, you'll go to hell, right? Instead, you can say, if you do this, you might make your life more difficult, right? Because then it's almost like I'm in charge of my destiny now. So if I decide that I want to learn how to drive a motorcycle, I have to understand that I have to be somebody who has a license. I can't just get on my friend's motorcycle who has a license and knows how to drive it and think that I can drive the way he can or she can. And I have to have the proper equipment on, and I have to know how to follow the speed limit and follow the rules. So you understand why all these steps are necessary, not to make your life difficult, but it's actually to help you live a life that's helpful for you to be happy, right? So in that way, if you bring it back to kids and parents, you can understand how we would be encouraged to try to meet each other halfway, and why we all want to sort of accept the idea of what postmodern thought is, that it is to understand the past, and we do have to deconstruct it to some degree to help ourselves make meaning of, how do I personalize this understanding so that I can be creative with it, and that I can talk about it and not feel like I'm threatened in any way, or that we as a family get into disagreements and then we write each other off, and then we're unable to kind of communicate anymore because, well, I can't talk to you anymore because you disrespected this of our past, or right? And then it becomes almost like, well, can't we get past this? And then it becomes generational, and then kids, and then cousins, and imagine what inheritance gets involved with, if there's like money and all these heirlooms that you have to kind of give out, and right, it just becomes rife for tension, and you don't really want to have that propelling itself through time. So with that, I'm going to kind of end, just to kind of keep these relatively segmented, and allow yourself to do this with generosity to yourself. So if there are ideas that you feel very meaningful, are very meaningful for you, and maybe you've burnt a bridge in the past because it was just that something that you felt very strongly about and someone else felt strongly about their idea and they can't really coincide yet, allow yourself that time and just maybe reach out in some way and say, you know what, I'm doing this, and do you want to try trying something new with me? And it doesn't have to be related to any of what that is, but it's just a way of kind of rekindling some kind of relationship. Because when I was doing my early childhood study training, I had read this small booklet. I wish I remember what it was called, but it was talking about the different dynamics within siblings and families, and how sometimes if something doesn't get resolved, in some way it gets recycled through time or through your own life or with other relationships, and it doesn't manifest in a healthy way. So it's almost to say, when people say, if you hold on to a grudge, you end up burning yourself. It is true to some degree, because if you can't work out a relationship somewhere, it hinders you from building healthy relationships in the future. And you want to always have that positive karma almost waiting for you in the future. So if we all start to kind of understand how we can move forward with tradition rather than just tearing it down, and keeping ourselves secular as well as maybe religious, if I can use that word, and then continue a postmodern lens, or looking with a postmodern lens, meaning we want to keep certain truths valid, like about the universe, for example, but we also want to create our own meaning that's personable to us, and learn how to relate that to what other people hold as true relative to what their historical narrative might have been. And from that, I think we'll be able to understand why dogma is a thing that we can kind of reevaluate, how inspiration works, how to be creative with it, and then the impact that that has on our mindset and what we think we need to hold as true, and keep constructing as we can't change our mind about this, to, well, why not? And how can we be flexible? And then understand neuroplasticity and how being flexible with these ideas that we used to kind of be rigid about actually enables creativity and allows for a lot of that syncretism and pluralism to continue to flourish in our life.